Okay, Audrey, a little bit of background. You and I met a couple months ago, I guess now, at an event for LinkedIn creators at the headquarters in Mountain View. And I'm pretty sure you're the youngest person on the panel, but you did not seem like it at all. You were totally in control and confident and awesome. And when I found out that you'd taken a gap year, I was like, we have to talk to this person more. So I actually don't know that much about your gap year. So this is like actually a conversation that's playing out in real time. So thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. I remember just hearing about bits and pieces of your story as well during the panel that we shared, and I'm looking forward to hearing more.
Awesome. So I took a look at the website, and just to give folks a little bit of a background of what you're up to. So you've been quite busy because even though you're only a freshman at Stanford, you've already spoken at the UN, been featured in Forbes, started a company, and you've been running this kind of nonprofit for 6 years. And so this nonprofit, which is We Tech, Women in Tech, from what I understand, the goal is to achieve gender equality in the tech industry through increased networking opportunities and mentors for young women interested in entering the tech industry. Tell us where you got the idea.
Definitely. So WeTech was really born out of a lack of resources and community that I experienced within the Philippine tech scene. I remember when I was growing up, I didn't really have any role models in tech industry that I felt like I could relate to personally. So when I thought of the big names in tech, I thought of like Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, figures that were very distant from my own story, my own upbringing. So I decided that if I didn't know of any young women in tech, I wanted to go out there and like find my own role models for myself. And that's really how WeTech was born. I started this blog back in 2016 to feature the different stories of women in tech that I had networked with on platforms like LinkedIn and Instagram. And I would cold message them and I'd say that I'd love to interview them for the WeTech blog and put their stories into a format in which other young girls such as myself could read their articles and like be inspired by their journeys. And that transformed into us hosting the first Women in Tech conference for students and vice students in the Philippines in partnership with Accenture. And we started after that doing outreach and going into low income communities and bringing secondhand tech materials, laptops, and really aiming to bridge the digital divides in technology. So we're completely student led, and it's really crazy because now we have operations in over 20 and over 25 chapters around the world, and that spans over 10 countries. So it's been quite a journey, and I'm really excited to dive into how my gap year helped us get there.
Yeah, I saw that you even have like a California chapter, right?
We do, yeah. We have California, New Jersey, New York, within the United States, and Michigan.
I think it's an awesome story to see like a tech organization come from Manila and then have like a chapter in California as opposed to vice versa. So congrats on that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really cool. And I think that is largely because of social media and just the way that we're able to increase visibility of our organization through platforms like LinkedIn and Instagram.
What got you interested in tech as you were growing up? Like, especially given the dynamics, gender dynamics that you're describing, where it's like, not necessarily something that maybe women in the Philippines are kind of steered towards doing.
I remember vividly that I first became interested in technology when I was in a computer class back in elementary school. So in the Philippines, for context, we have to take this government mandated computer class, but it doesn't necessarily have to deal with programming. It's more on how to use Microsoft Office, think about Word, PowerPoint, Excel. So things that I didn't find too exciting until one day my teacher decided to go completely off curriculum and introduced us to this game where a snake had to navigate a maze using blocks that represented lines of code. And to me, that was such a mental breakthrough that like, whoa, the apps and the games and the social media that I was using on a day-to-day basis were made using code. And I immediately became more intrigued about how I could learn about technology and how it really impacts your day-to-day. So I asked my teacher if we'd be learning more about programming. And I was told that it isn't part of the Philippine curriculum, but I could go online and look up resources from there. So essentially, that's what I did. I would Google how to learn how to code, free CS resources. And I was introduced to a large, like overwhelmingly large amount of content online, like Codecademy and code.org. I found Harvard's introductory CS lectures all on YouTube for free. And I would watch those in my free time. And that was how my interest in tech initially got sparked.
That's awesome. I'm just noticing a friend from grad school, Oliver, who's in the Philippines as well, working in tech, is listening. So Oliver, if you have anything you'd like to chime in about with tech education in Philippines or your experience, just raise your hand and I can bring you in. That goes for everyone as well. But that's awesome. That game you're describing, that was like the only games that we could play in my computer classes when we were learning. It was like these little like, green and black computer screens, but I won't regale you with how old I am. Okay, so you kind of learned about the kind of building blocks of tech. You got excited about it, and then you're off to the races. You're starting a nonprofit when you're in 10th grade. Like, how did that go? How did that feel? And tell me about your life leading up to your decision to take a gap year.
Starting WeTech was something that happened quite organically. And I say this because we began as a blog and out of necessity transferred into becoming a community organization when we saw that there weren't many, if any, like events catered towards young girls wanting to go into tech in the Philippines. And the few events that we did see were very inaccessible to generally like high school, college aged women. It was more towards like already women working in the tech industry. And we wanted to create an event that could be catered to giving a crash course in different aspects of tech, or just something that's really conducive for young girls to step into the tech industry for the first time, or like experiment and learn a programming language per se for the first time. So we did that, and we ended up doing a lot of outreach work after that, because we also noticed that at the events that we did plan, there was such a big accessibility gap that was present, and that most of our events were based in Metro Manila. So that in itself limited the audience to people in the capital that had the access and the means to go to these different events. And we acknowledge that in the Philippines, a country where Wi-Fi connectivity, access to tech education is such a big issue, if we wanted to really talk about equality in the tech industry, we needed to make sure that everybody, regardless of which part of the country they're from, got that access to introductory tech materials. So we went to Marawi in 2018, and Marawi is a southern province in the Philippines that was bombed in 2017, the year before we went, due to suspected terrorists in the area. And we were teaching kids living in evacuation centers how to code for the first time. And it was really exciting just having those moments with them and seeing the excitement on their faces as they coded for the first time using Scratch, a lot of them had never used laptops before. So the laptops that we brought in and donated we left with the public school that we were working with. And it made me think a lot about how so many young people from the Philippines could have these exciting careers in tech, but they miss out on it because they don't get that introductory, that basic CS education, tech literacy education even, that I feel like a lot of people from the cities or like from private schools, for instance, like get access to already. So that's how we really transformed advocacy into not just getting more women in tech, but more people in tech regardless of their gender and socioeconomic status. And because of all these projects, and I've only listed a couple, but we also do like women and tech talks where we have women talk about how they use technology to achieve sustainable development goals. We do coding camps. We do a lot of different activities. And basically my schedule throughout high school was backed. And I was telling you this earlier, DJ, but I almost burnt out in high school because of how much work I was putting on my plate with college application season, running around like doing all these projects and all these talks for WeTech. I was barely getting any sleep. And that was when my parents actually suggested that I work on WeTech full time before going to university in the US. So at that time, like I had gotten an offer from Stanford, and I read online that I was able to take a year or two off. And I was so amazed by that because I think growing up in the Philippines, being born and raised in Manila, I was really raised into this mindset by everybody around me that like you go to school, you get into the best university you can, you work a couple of years, and then you think about how to make a difference in your community. But with WeTech, I wanted to make a difference then and there, like before going to university. And I thought that the gap year would be a really great way to really put all my effort into doing that before heading off to the US.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was actually reading on Stanford's website earlier today. So how they describe it is for first year students, a leave of absence lasts the rest of the academic year. You can take a leave of absence for just 1 or 2 quarters or up to a year at a time. And you're allowed 8 quarters of leave during your Stanford career. So you can take up to essentially 2 years without just kind of letting them know, and you come back and just kind of slot back in. And I was thinking about, most of the people that I know that went to Stanford took at least 1 quarter off, which I think is pretty rare, but it sounds like it's happening more and more, which is pretty exciting. So like, that's awesome that you're able to do that. And say a little bit more about how your parents, it sounds like it was their idea.
Yeah, people find that really interesting when I talk about how my parents were so supportive of my gap year. I think that in a lot of Asian cultures, in the Philippines specifically, it's very uncommon for students to go on gap years, and much less common for the parents to be very supportive of it. So my parents and we have a very close relationship, and they, from day one, have been big supporters of WeTech. And I think that's what really led them to really have no hesitations in supporting my gap year as well, because they saw how much time I was putting into the organization and how doing school and WeTech was really putting me on the verge of burnout. I remember for a large chunk of my junior year and senior year of high school, I would have days where I'd be getting like 3 or 4 hours of sleep. I was doing college applications, doing the SATs and SAT subject tests, and I was also hopping onto talks like right after classes ended in the day. So when they told me that taking a year off was something that they would support, I think that was just a large weight that was lifted off my shoulders, and just this really large validation as well, that they saw my work as something that they really respected and really, really want to support. I think when we're talking about student-led organizations in the Philippines, there's this tendency for a lot of adults, at least in my experience, a lot of adults that I work with in like the tech industry and the nonprofit scene to look down on student-led organizations or see them as less kind of like established as other nonprofits because the people working on them are studying at the same time. But I think it's beginning to change. And I think that with more and more student organizations being set up in the country, back in the Philippines, I think we're seeing people really believe in the power of student-led organizations. Because a lot of the time, like I think with the people that I work with WeTech, just because these people have full academic loads, that just makes it even more exciting working with them, because you get to see like the passion and the commitment that they have to the organization, to the cause, because they're making time for it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So one of the things that, one reflection from what you said, I was doing research on gap years just more generally. And in 2000, Harvard Dean of Admissions published this like New York Times op-ed basically saying we need kids to take a year off before starting school because they're burnt out. And, a funny reaction to the work that I'm doing on sabbaticals that folks have is like, oh, people that are younger will say like, oh, well, I don't feel like I've worked long enough to deserve a sabbatical yet. Or older folks will say, like, I can't believe people are taking, like young folks are taking at the beginning of their career, like they haven't even worked that long yet. Like, what could they possibly be tired or burnt out about? And I think that what folks don't understand is increasingly, and I felt this in my generation, and I understand that it's even more ratcheted up for yours, like the process of going to college, figuring out what you want to do is starting earlier and earlier. And the types of things you have to do to get into a place like Stanford, I mean, obviously you did, right? So you're starting a nonprofit, you're in like Model UN, you're playing varsity tennis, like you're going to like a international baccalaureate school. Like that's an extraordinary amount of stress and strain.
I agree. And I was nodding while you were talking, and I realized that my video isn't on. And I do agree that the preparation time is becoming earlier and earlier as the years go by. Like I get Instagram DMs from 9th graders saying that they want my advice on what extracurriculars they should do or like what they should write their essays about, which is crazy to me because they're in 9th grade and they're already planning their Stanford essays. I think that kind of speaks to the climate of the college application ecosystem. And the crazy thing to me is that I didn't do any of those extracurriculars. I didn't start WeTech with the intent of getting into Stanford. Like to me, I just wanted to live the most like exciting and fulfilling high school experience that I could. And if that would help me get into a good university, then so be it. I think I was really doing VTech because I felt as if I couldn't not do anything to help make the tech scene more equal. It was like this itch that I had to scratch. And I just felt like I couldn't sit and wait for someone else to start these women in tech conferences or go into these low-income communities to bring in tech literacy programs. Like, I think there's this tendency that I've noticed with a lot of people in the Philippines, at least, to wait for a project to start up and then join it. And I kind of just wanted to start it myself. And I do agree, though, that the competitive atmosphere of college applications has also kind of tarnished a bit how student-led organizations are perceived. Like, I would say that a lot of organizations are started just to be put on the college application or to be put on the resume, and then it kind of dies out afterwards. Like, that's a trend that I've noticed. But I think genuinely for some of the students listening, because I see some people here listening that are students as well that I know through LinkedIn. Hello. I think that it's really important to just start an organization because you want to solve the issue that it is based around, and anything else that comes out of it, any like awards or press or just like resume things that you can add to it, like that's just a bonus.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to get back to what you said about your parents, because I want to dig into this. I think one of the reasons, you mentioned like the stereotype of Asian parents, but like for me, just the stereotype of all parents is that like there's no way that my parents were going to let me take a year off to, quote unquote vacation. I was going to go to college because if I didn't, I would never finish my degree. And, how would it look and all that kind of stuff. So like, what is it about your parents that you think gave them that perspective? Like, what did they do growing up? Like, how did you think about work growing up? What example did they kind of show you?
Growing up, my parents were very hands-on parents in the sense that they both did careers in banking, and then they retired shortly after my mom had me. And this, I think, was a very deliberate decision because they realized that for the first couple of years of my life, if they stuck with banking and that kind of career, they would barely see me grow up. And I think it made my dad especially really sad because he was working extra long hours and he didn't want to like miss a lot of crucial life moments for me, so I'm told. And I think looking back, that was so formative that they decided to take work from home jobs before everybody else was doing work from home, because that meant that my dad's office was at home, my mom's office was at home. I could easily pop in and out and like talk to them for a chat. They would bring me to and from school. So they really got to see what my day-to-day was like. They would hear about every single experience that I had that day, how school went, how WeTech was going. And I'm very close to them because of that, and also just because of their open-mindedness when it came to my education. So in the Philippines, it's not, at least in Filipino Chinese culture, so my dad's Chinese and my mom is Filipino Chinese. So I was raised with a lot of Filipino and Chinese values. And it's very uncommon, I think, in those societies, Chinese specifically, for Filipino Chinese parents to let their eldest or their only daughter go abroad to the US. There's kind of that mindset that it's still very patriarchal and that you don't really send like the girls abroad, which I know is like a very like unfortunate, very like old fashioned thing. So my extended family like still kind of has that very like conservativeness to them, but my parents like were very open-minded about it. Like they saw how much I wanted to go abroad and how committed like I am to my organization and to the opportunities that going abroad could bring. So I think from the get-go, my parents were really such like formative people with just me creating an advocacy as well, because I remember ranting to them about the gender gap in tech, the issues within the tech industry. And when I came up with WeTech as a blog, my parents never said to me, oh, like you're too young to be doing this. They never said you should be focusing on school instead of this project. And instead they asked questions. They were like, oh, what are you going to do about like your posting like schedule for the blog? Like how often are you going to roll out interviews? They would say things like, oh, like you have a talk like after class, okay, we'll drive you, but you need to like make sure that you get like your homework done too. So it was never like a question of can you do it, can you run this organization? It was more just a question of like are you going to be okay are you eating enough? Are you sleeping enough? And I think just having that positioning of a support system was so meaningful, especially during the really rough like 2 years of junior and senior year of high school, in which I was so overwhelmed and doing like a million things at once. I know looking back at those moments, like what really anchored me was like going home, having dinner with my parents and talking to them about, say, an organizational issue that I was facing, or like this partnership maybe that was giving me a lot of grief that I needed their input on. And just like them having that open-mindedness to talk to me about it and like understand bits and pieces of tech that they didn't grow up in, I think was really something that helped my gap year and just like my upbringing as a whole.
Yeah, let's move on to the gap year. I want to underline what you just said, and I wonder if that experience that's been forced by the pandemic of more parents kind of working from home and like actually being witness to the stress and strain of their kids, as opposed to only seeing little snippets of it, if that will result in more kind of empathy around like, oh, maybe they do actually really need a break versus needing to stay on the straight and narrow path. Like, I'm not sure, but it sounds like that had the effect on your father, at least.
I think so. And I think that when my parents and I were approaching the college application season and they were talking to other parents about like how their kids were handling it, like they were able to see that they were so much closer to me and how I was going with those applications. Like they got to like see my progress. They saw me like talk about it, and we did like talk about what it was like to go through just like the interviews and things like that. I'm thinking specifically about how with a lot of Filipino Chinese parents in the Philippines, I think there's that distance that like, oh, the kids will like do the applications, like they'll sort it out themselves. But what I was really happy with my upbringing was that my parents were there if I wanted them to help me like process things or like talk over like this essay idea, but they never like forced themselves onto my applications. Like they never told me like, oh, you know, you have to do this or that, or like apply it to like this school or that school. Like Stanford was my decision. Like if I didn't apply to Stanford, they still would have been happy with me. I think it's just funny that it worked out like that, because I think within a lot of like Chinese culture specifically, there's very much that expectation to like overachieve and just like work. But my parents instilled it in me, like the working hard aspect, like quite organically. And I think that was also simply born out of like seeing them work really hard. Like my dad actually has his own organization called Library Hub Philippines. And what they do is that they bring secondhand books to different public schools around the Philippines that have very outdated textbooks. So he's literally going to islands where textbooks are in like the 1980s, which is insane because they're overlooked by the national education system. And like my dad does that full time, like, or not like full time, but he does that with his job, but like he doesn't get paid for it at all. Like he does it because he believes in it. And just like seeing that growing up and like seeing his dedication to advocacy as well, I think in hindsight really instilled in me like doing work, not just because you get paid, like you should be doing work because you like love the advocacy.
That's awesome. I love that. I'm wondering why you chose, so you mentioned it's rare or it's difficult to kind of convince your family to go abroad for school. Like, why did you have your mindset on going abroad, and why Stanford?
I remember that I was considering going abroad when I was in the 7th or 8th grade. And that's because my mom's older sister immigrated from the Philippines to Hong Kong and then Hong Kong to Oxford. And when I visited Oxford for the very first time, I remember just like being so in awe because I never really clocked in the fact that there are like universities abroad. Like I know sensibly that they existed. I just never had like a mental like picture for them. And just like walking around Oxford, seeing like all the resources. I remember going into, it was Bodleian Library, I believe, like one of like their oldest libraries, and thinking like, there's so many books here. Like there's so many resources. Like there's so much to learn. And that's when I really, really internalized this idea that I could potentially apply to universities outside of the Philippines. And my parents were like, oh yeah, like maybe like if you really want, like we can like think about it, because I was like in 7th, 8th grade at the time. And fast forward to a couple of years later, like I was studying out with VTech and I was getting really into the tech industry. And that really got me thinking about how the US is really positioned as currently the center of the tech industry, specifically in Silicon Valley. And I wanted to be able to get access to those resources, those companies, and just really immerse myself in tech. And that was when the conversation started shifting to the US. And when I did my research, I saw that schools like Stanford, for instance, offered really interdisciplinary programs in tech because I knew that I wanted to do something in the tech industry. I knew that I wanted it to be interdisciplinary in the sense that I loved learning about like the latest technologies and different programming languages, but I also love talking about the ethics of technology, thinking about how to make it more accessible to everyone. And I discovered this really cool program at Stanford called Science, Technology, and Society, which is basically a major that I'm currently doing that studies the intersections of science and society and how we basically shape tech and how tech shapes us. And I take really interesting classes in sociology, CS, artificial intelligence, data science. And it's so exciting because it's all the parts of technology that I love, but also thinking about like the crucial elements as to like how it impacts our day-to-day world. So that's what I'm currently studying. And I'm also doing a minor in education in which I'm focusing on edtech. So I think if I stayed in the Philippines, I would not be able to study STS as a major. I would not be able to do a minor in education or like be able to combine just like all these different disciplines. And the more I remember when I was reading about Stanford's STS program when I was in high school, like I became so invested in this idea of going to Stanford because it was also very much, if I don't get into this type of school with this STS program, like I won't be able to study STS like anywhere else, like in the Philippines especially. So it was very much like that thought that pushed me to work really hard and to really like put a lot of time into my applications and really pitch to my parents the benefits of going abroad to the US.
That's awesome. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And, I wonder, I think it's a good segue to talk about the gap year itself, but I wonder like how, or if your kind of decision to choose the major or anything changed as a result of your time off. So, okay, so your parents suggest a gap year. You're like, great, I'll just work, solely on WeTech. Like, tell me how it felt. So you graduated from high school and instead of going to college, you're like full-time on your nonprofit. Like, what did you do? And walk us through that year.
The decision to take a gap year was also largely solidified when I sat down and I started writing all the events, conferences that I had planned for the next 12 months, all the projects with VTech that I wanted to pursue. And another thing that's important to note is that I was also planning on transitioning operations for VTech to be like independent in the Philippines without me. So I knew I wanted to keep the executive director position and still manage all of our chapters, but I knew that like I couldn't be running the Philippine-based events anymore because of my distance, because of moving to the United States. So a lot of it was very much organizational transition that I wanted to smooth out as I went from like the Philippines to Palo Alto. And when I was writing all those plans down in a Google Doc, I knew deep down that I wasn't going to be able to do all of these things like to the T. Like I knew that gap years can a lot of unexpected things can happen. Case in point, there was COVID during my gap year and a lot of my plans kind of got like thrown into the air. But what I liked about having that loose structure on a Google document was that I had something to look to. I had like something to give me direction during those like 12, 13 months that I took off before school. And one thing that I remember is that a lot of the time, when COVID just hit, I was like midway through my gap year. And I remember being a bit panicky and telling my dad, like, oh no, like this is going to ruin like all my plans. But we adapted with VTech. Like we started just doing like more and more online meetings. A lot of the talks that I had scheduled became from like in person to like online. And I was still able to do, if anything, like even more work now that everybody was like transitioning online. So I think to the people listening that are kind of hesitant to go on gap years because they don't know like how much they can do during COVID. I think if you have the resources to do work online, I think there's so many opportunities available and there's so many things that you can do with it because a lot of people are also transitioning to online work and like are able to like adapt to it as well.
Yeah. So, okay. So you start out and you kind of navigate the changes to WeTech. Like, what did it feel like, doing a full-time job kind of for the first time and like, the change of being around your peers in high school, like
Was that tough seeing folks kind of move on to the next step? Or was that easy because you were surrounded by awesome people at WeTech?
I think it was only really tough when I would see the people that got accepted into Stanford during the same year as me, like start Stanford and do all the fun orientation things and go to all the like classes and post about it on social media. Like I remember when orientation week swung by, I was telling my mom like, "Ooh, like should I have just like gone? Should I not have like taken this gap year? Like everything looks so fun." And I remember that was just such a fleeting thought because literally the month after I was flying to Portugal to attend the Web Summit, which is the biggest tech, like literally the biggest tech conference in the world. And like my ticket was paid for by the Philippine Embassy of Portugal. They invited me to speak at their embassy and like I like was like hosted there and I didn't have to like worry about accommodations. So there are just so many opportunities that I wouldn't have simply been able to say yes to if I was doing a load of classes and I was in Palo Alto. Like I also got to go to Thailand as well during my gap year and attend and speak at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Young Entrepreneurs Carnival. I gave one of the talks there and I was able to network with so many amazing entrepreneurs from places like Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore. And so those moments definitely where I felt like I was missing out on like quote unquote like teenager experiences, like going to those college events and like being with my peers, like those were like fleeting moments because I realized that there would have been so much as well that I would have missed out on had I like gone straight to university.
That's awesome that you got to do those things kind of full fare. How were you feeling? Because you mentioned you were feeling burnt out. Like, do you remember what your mindset was? Were you working less hard? Were you getting more sleep? Were you able to kind of do stuff to restore your health, or did you just kind of like fill up all your time with WeTech?
This question makes me think about how when I would see my family during my gap year, a lot of them would joke like, "Oh, it must be like so relaxing, like, you know, being on vacation for a year." And then my dad stuck up for me. He was like, "You know, she's not on vacation. Like she's working as hard as she does like during the school year." And I think that really speaks to what my life was like during that gap year. Like if anything, I was on even more calls than I normally would be on. I was like hopping from meeting to meeting, sometimes like pre-COVID, like physically as well, like just like traveling around like Manila and Southeast Asia. And I was always on the go. And I think that what really kept me sane during those months when things were really intense and like for the most part in person pre-COVID was just having a very good workout routine, really making sure to make time to get enough sleep. So that's another thing. I was doing more WeTech work than ever, but I was also getting more sleep than I ever did in high school. And I think that as a whole just let me become a much more like well-rounded person. So I was like waking up in the morning and I had like a workout routine and then I'd hop on calls and then I'd spend time with my parents, have lunch with them. I'd do like a talk, like 1 or 2 talks in the afternoon, but it's like in person or online. And then I'd like rest for the rest of the day. And just having that flexibility as well to decide how many calls I want to take in a day, at what time I can take them, because I don't have to worry about it conflicting with classes. Like that was so powerful to me. And it also gave me the ability to be pretty spontaneous with saying yes to different invitations. Like a week before I went to Thailand to speak at the Entrepreneurs Carnival that I mentioned earlier, I also got invited to speak at the United Nations headquarters in Bangkok. And that was something that happened like all within like a span of a week. So we had to sort out a lot of logistics and work out like scheduling, things like that. But it's crazy because that's how I got to meet a lot of like foreign dignitaries and representatives that were visiting the UN as well during that time. And sometimes I think back to how that never would have happened if I was all the way in Palo Alto. Like I couldn't conceivably like fly in like a week before, like with classes and everything. So definitely like a large part of the spontaneity of my gap year is something that I like crave and I really want to be able to experience again at some point.
Yeah, I know the feeling very well with, you know, doing work on sabbaticals. The easy joke is like, oh, so you're on sabbaticals writing a book about sabbatical? I certainly do not feel like I'm on sabbatical. Did you, so at one point you had mentioned that you shifted from just working on WeTech to doing other things. internships. Like, how were you? Tell us about that transition, and then what happened to the organization as you kind of prepared it for yourself to be gone the next year?
So I worked a part-time job alongside running VTech, and my part-time job was with education.ph. And education.ph is an edtech company based in the Philippines that aims to democratize access to education, whether that be in the application process. So for context, in the Philippines right now, to apply to universities, you typically have to mail in applications. But what Education wants to do is digitalize that and make sort of like a common application in which students can just like apply from their computers and not have to send in all that paperwork, which causes loads of problems. They also have different events and blogs and content which gives like Philippine students context into like what type of majors they can explore, career advice, that sort of thing. So it was overall a company that I really wanted to explore because I had met the founder as well during my first ever speaking engagement. So when I gave my first talk for VTech, I was like 16, I think, and it was to a room of like 1,100, 200 people at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations like entrepreneurship event in Manila. So that was like a really crazy thing. It all went by in a blur. But I distinctly remember the CEO and founder of Education, Henry, who I just found out you went to grad school with. So that's really exciting. I was approached by him because he was also speaking at that event, and he heard me talk about women in tech and tech equality in the Philippines. And he gave me his card and said like, oh, if ever you want to do work with Education, like we'd love to have you. So I took him up on that offer. Yeah, like years later, I took him up on that offer, and I told him that I really want to get some experience working in ed tech. Like, will you let me get that experience out of your company? And I'm really glad that I did that, because I think while I love nonprofit work and while that holds a really special place in my heart, I know deep down that I'm going to have to enter industry someday. And I want to enter industry and like get that experience as well. I'm a huge believer of like learning in the classroom, but also like applying things outside. And I knew that with ed tech, like that was something that like, yes, I could learn like hypothetically, like in the classroom, I could listen to talks, I could do my research, but I think it's completely different, like going out into the industry and like meeting people and like doing the work and like really getting to know what that's like from like a hands-on perspective. So I worked at Education for a large chunk of my gap year. I'd say like 3/4 of my gap year. I was doing online work with them. I was writing content for their blog. I was helping with their social media marketing. I was just like learning bits and pieces of what it's like managing like an edtech company versus like a nonprofit. And that was a really, really eye-opening experience. And that also gave me something to focus on as well when I wasn't doing VTech work. And for a large part, when I was doing VTech work, I was doing talks, doing partnership calls, but also helping restructure the organization so that operations could continue with me not being so hands-on on Philippine operations. And I'm so glad that I took the time to focus on that, because WeTech Manila is honestly really thriving right now and doing a lot of really exciting projects with the leadership of presidents that I like worked really hands-on with like before they took those roles. And it's crazy because both presidents of WeTech Manila that took the positions last year and like this year, like they were people that I have known like since they entered the organization when they were like, I think in their freshman years of high school, freshman or sophomore years of high school, and now they're at university and running VTech. So that's just really insane to me that like we built that community and that like support system. Yeah, like I feel like they've kind of grown up with VTech, and I've heard that phrase being thrown around a couple of times with a lot of our younger members that have been with us for a couple of years. Like, I think growing up with an organization, like I've grown up with VTech, is such a fun thing because you get to see not just like how the projects grow and how it impacts other people, but how it also shapes you as an individual. And I'm really glad to say that like we've built not just a community that sets up these projects and does these like tech workshops and like goes into these communities to bring like secondhand laptops and like modules, but we've also created a community of people that are now really just like friends with each other and like have a support system for one another in tech, which I think is so important.
Yeah, that's Awesome. I have a feeling you're going to be writing a lot of recommendation letters for people's applications to Stanford and other places like that.
Oh yeah, I have. Like that's a really funny thing. Like I've written like college application rec letters, and I was on the phone with my mom like when I was doing that, and I was telling her like I feel simultaneously really old, but like really happy about it. like I didn't think that I'd be doing that. I was like 19 when I started writing recommendation letters for people, and I told my mom that like this is such a strange feeling. Like, and then she said it speaks to like how WeTech has like shaped these people's lives, and I'm like, that's crazy because it's like I feel like I don't really notice those milestones until like I stop and think about it and really process it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same experience that you have when you graduate from college. Like you go to a career fair, right? Like junior, senior year, and then you graduate from college and you're working at a company that sends you to the career fair. Like you realize that it's just people that are basically like you with, you know, a year's difference that are on the other side of the table. But it was so intimidating when you're on the student side of the table. So you're getting this like turn the tables experience early.
Exactly. And I think if anything, it was just so refreshing as well, like writing those recommendations and like really reflecting on the relationships that these people have formed with like myself and with WeTech. I think when we're in university, there's this tendency to always go like on to the next thing or just like go to class and like hang out with your friends. Like it's so like fast paced, especially at Stanford. Like there's a never ending list of events to go to, people to meet, mixers, free food, free boba, that sort of thing. But I think some of my favorite moments so far in university have been like those moments where I've actually taken the time to pause and really think about all the things I'm just so lucky to experience, I think, with WeTech, with Stanford as a whole. Like moments like this where I get to hop on really cool calls and talks with people like you, DJ. Like they help me really process things. And I just want to thank you for that as well.
Oh, appreciate it. You've earned it. And I think like, you know, the fact that you're able to step back as are you a rising sophomore?
Oh, sorry about that. So that is an unupdated bio. I'm a rising junior right now at school. So I have 2 years left before I graduate.
Cool. Yeah, but like having that kind of perspective at that age, I think is just super valuable. I mean, I don't know if you can credit it towards your gap year, since it sounds like you were kind of a pretty introspective person that seemed in control of what you were doing. But do you like when you look at how you're experiencing Stanford versus some of your classmates? Like, I know this is tough to say, but do you feel like you were doing it differently than folks who didn't take a gap year, or do you feel like you're approaching it differently than you would have had you not taken off?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question because with COVID, a lot of people took gap years because they didn't want to start university under like the COVID circumstances and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I think just like the rationale for me taking a gap year was very different from like my peers. I sensed like a kind of avoidance of online classes, which is really valid. Just wanted to put that out there. But my gap year was really driven towards like the things that I wanted to do instead of like going straight to school. But that's I still have met like a lot of people that took time off to work on their companies or like so a lot of the times like sell their companies and like start new things and new projects and also continue their nonprofit work or work full-time internships with all these different companies as well. So I think there is no like typical like Stanford student gap year. That's another thing that I've noticed because people that I've met have also taken time off because they wanted to avoid online classes but ended up like starting different projects or living like abroad for a year and like learning a new language. And what gives me a lot of joy is just hearing about other people's gap years at university and like learning like their stories and like their experiences, because I think while I'm a fairly introspective person, I think I credit so much of the introspection to like my gap year and like the ability and to have the time to sit back and like think and journal and process things at the end of the day. Because when I was in high school and I was always on the go, at the end of the day, I was honestly just really exhausted and I didn't really have time to think and process. But during my gap year, I actually had like the luxury of more time. And I was able to really like sit back and like talk about how like my day went with my parents and talk about how like the panel that I spoke on went or how like our projects are going on BTech. because so much of the time in high school, when I sat down at the dinner table, like, yes, I was still really excited about the work that I was doing, but I was also just like really tired and just like thinking about when I was going to get to go to bed, all the work that I had to do, like the never ending to-do list and whatnot. So I think that was always on my mind. And now going back to school and like to the fast-pacedness of Stanford, like it's something that I have to remind myself intentionally to do, to sit back and like process and like incorporate that in my routine.
If you were to compare Audrey now at Stanford to Audrey in high school pre-gap year, do you feel like you're managing that like fire hose of information and opportunities better?
Definitely. I think I know myself a lot better now, which I feel like is such a cheesy gap year alum thing to say, but it's true. Like I feel like I know what I need to stay sane. Like I know that I need like a good workout routine and at least like 8 hours of sleep. But I also know deep down that through putting all that time into WeTech, into the edtech scene, like I know now more than ever that that's what I want to do with my life. Like I want to work in that industry with people that care about issues like equality and diversity and inclusion. And if I didn't take that gap year, I think I would always wonder what it would have been like to just throw myself into those industries and work really, really hard in them. So I would say that I know myself better now post gap year. And I recommend like taking a gap year to anybody that has kind of like that itch as well, to know what it's like to throw yourself into an industry before like studying about it formally.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting things about your story to me is there's, with sabbaticals in general and then gap years specifically, this notion that it's like a thing that only kind of posh, like British kids can do and just travel around the world on the backpacker circuit. But, like your experience, A, you were working like almost the entire time. B, it sounds like you also found ways to get paid even when you were doing nonprofit stuff, through applying to fellowships or whatnot. What would you kind of say to folks that are concerned about the cost and being able to kind of float that instead of going to college?
Mm-hmm. I will preface this with saying that I'm incredibly lucky that my parents, like housed me and they made sure that I got enough food during my gap year. Just like basic things like that are like these like such privileges that I didn't need to worry about. And I will say though that working like a part-time job while doing nonprofit work like was a deliberate decision as well on my part to want to save up money for university, because I knew that when I got to school, like I wouldn't have as much time to work. And it was only in my sophomore year. So my entire freshman year, I was just focusing on like academics and BTech, and then sophomore, like the summer before sophomore year, and like for the rest of sophomore year, I was like working part-time jobs with the university. I did a job with Stanford Summer Session, which is like the high school program of Stanford. I'm doing currently like research work with the Graduate School of Education, things like that. But a large part of that ed tech job that I worked as well, which is also wanting to save up money and like knowing that going to university is expensive, especially I think coming from the Philippines to the United States. I knew that was something that I wanted to save up for. And I do think that there is still that perception that people that take gap years are like, as you said, like posh. I'm not going to deny that like a large part of taking a gap year is just having that like privilege as well, to whether it's in like having parents that support you and like want or like able to like house you and like help like take care of some of like your necessities. But I do think as well that just having that time or like being able to take time off and not just like rush straight into university and then right into work in itself is like such a privilege that I'm really grateful that I was able to do. I would also say though that for people that are listening that are kind of on the verge of, do I take a gap year? Do I not want to take a gap year? And if like finances are a large part of it as well, like there are so many paid internships that are being offered that you can take before like going to university, especially like with these tech companies. Like they pay like quite a decent amount, especially like in the United States. I'm not too familiar with paid internships in the Philippines, so I know like within the tech scene in the United States, like they can provide quite like large stipends, quite large like hourly wages. And I think that working full-time as well before going to university can offer such an enriching experience, based on like what my friends have said, the ones that have taken that route instead of doing like full-time nonprofit work.
Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love the reframe of instead of a gap year being something that drains the bank account, like using it as something that actually fills up the bank account before you go to college. Because I was cramming a bunch of work into the summer between high school and college. I worked way too much, didn't get a chance to do as much hanging out as I wanted to do in order to kind of stock that bank account. And so thinking about like instead of traveling, even if you would travel for a little bit of it and work for half or most of it, decreasing your burn rate by being with your parents and things like that is a totally different way of thinking about it. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's like a big thing as well that I need to acknowledge, that taking a gap year for financial reasons is totally something that I think a lot of people should know is an option. And I'm starting to think as well about people that I can connect you with that did that like I'd love to like hear featured as well.
Nice. Yeah, I'd love to. It sounds like this might be the first of many conversations. So I want to be conscious of your time because I know you're on vacation. Audrey, I wish you all the best on your vacation, on your college career. I hope that I can be helpful to you. And I know that you have been an inspiration to folks all over the world, both with what you're doing and then also with this gap year. So thank you for sharing that story. And any parting thoughts?
Ooh, thank you so much, DJ, for just this opportunity to reflect on my gap year, talk about the different things I've learned along the way. I think people should definitely be having more conversations about what it takes to plan a gap year and like how every person's gap year is so different and specific to their context. So this is my story and like what I went through. It definitely isn't a one size fits all kind of plan, but I will say that to anybody that is listening and considering taking a gap year is on one already, like there is no perfect gap year. Like, I don't think you should ever feel like you're doing the gap year right or wrong, because there really is like no singular way to experience a year in which you either dedicate yourself to passion projects, learn a new skill, work a full-time job. Like, I think overall, the gap year should just center around like reflection, if that's like the biggest thing that I would say it is. And that's something that I hope universally anyone that takes a year off gets to experience, like just that very formative moment of getting to know yourself better and getting to know like what you want to do.
Well said. Well said. Okay, we had Sancho raise his hand, so let me pull him in here and see what his question is.
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. What would I have done differently during my gap year? I think I would tell myself to stress less about the uncertainty of COVID impacting my gap year. But I think I'm also able to say that because I have like hindsight. Because when COVID hit, like it was so stressful not knowing how our projects were going to adapt. Like we were doing a lot of in-person computer science, tech literacy programs. We had a lot of that slated for VTech, and we obviously couldn't go into these schools and teach these kids because we couldn't go like there in person with COVID regulations and lockdown. So that was really stressful, like not knowing how we were going to adapt to that. And I think I would tell my younger past self that it would all work out, and that when you're working with a team of people that are like as committed to an advocacy as you are, like they will find ways to keep doing the work that needs to be done. Like we ended up doing online tech boot camps in which we get representatives to teach different programming languages, tech skills to students like via Zoom. We have a WeTech chapter in Batangas that has like a We Code for Kids camp, and the camp specifically teaches like elementary, middle school kids like basic programming skills. And it's really cute because like I see these screenshots of all these like little kids in front of their computers like learning, I think it was like Python or Java for the first time. And yeah, like really like believing in the adaptability of your team is something that I cannot stress enough. And I think for any like young nonprofit founder, like it's so important to recruit people that are as invested in the cause as you are, because that can go such a long way.
That's such a cool story. And thanks, Sancho. I think just the only things I would add, and thank you for asking that question, which I should have asked, which what you would have done differently is, I think that it's the test of an organization if a leader can step away from it. And so I think, that's gone really well for WeTech, and the network effects, I think, have carried it. But also, I mean, especially this early in your career, like don't be afraid to to stop doing something and move on. Like, don't let the thing kind of control you if it's no longer serving you. And feel free to think about these things as like an experiment. Otherwise you might not spend your year doing what you want to do because you feel like you have to keep working on something that you've done in the past. So there's two sides to that coin. Just giving you permission to also walk away and try something different.
Definitely. I think there's a lot of bravery in doing that, DJ, like acknowledging like what you no longer want to work on or finding what works or what doesn't for you. Like I had this entire crisis when I was in high school because I realized that I like coding. I liked CS, but I didn't like love it enough to do like software engineering or to do it as like a full-time job. And I thought to myself, like, am I any less of like a tech person just because I don't want to code for like most of my day? And like the more that I thought about it and like really talked to people in the industry, like that's when I realized that like that's okay. Like you don't have to be a software engineer to be in tech. Like there's so many avenues to do that. And it took like admitting to myself that like I didn't want this initial like CS major or CS path.
Totally. That's awesome. I wish I could say that I chose not to be in engineering after my freshman year, but my grades kind of dictated that. Okay, Audrey, I want to let you go. Enjoy your vacation. We'll be talking again soon, I'm sure. And thank you so much for folks coming and thanks for sharing your story, Audrey.
Thank you for having me, DJ.